Okay, Screencast 4. Last time I talked about the fact that monopolies are evil, and this time I'm going to talk about what the government can do about it in terms of regulating monopolies. So we've seen how evil monopolies are, and one of the things that is a misconception about monopolies is that they're illegal. They're actually not. It's not illegal to be a monopoly. It is illegal to do certain things to make yourself a monopoly, and I know that can be a distinction without a difference, but the fact is that monopolies can and do exist. And further, we saw at the very first screencast that natural monopolies, things like utility companies, cable companies, those kind of things, are inevitable. Some industries, it's going to make sense to have one dominant firm in that industry, like cable companies. So as a result of that, the government will often regulate monopolies, since they exist and sometimes they're inevitable, in order to deal with their negative impacts on society. So to give you an example of what I mean, every state typically has some governmental agency that does some of this work. In Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. I'll just click on the link and show you what that looks like. Here's their webpage. And you can see in the first paragraph, it says the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission regulates three cornerstone service industries in Minnesota's economy, i.e. electricity, natural gas, and telephone. So those are natural monopolies, and since they're going to exist, Minnesota's set up an administrative agency to try to deal with them. It says it's the Commission's responsibility to ensure that vendors of these services provide safe, adequate, and reliable service at a fair, reasonable rate, something that monopolists don't tend to do when we leave them on their own. Alright, so let's talk about what those regulations might entail. There are essentially two choices. The first choice is to force monopolies to be allocatively efficient. Last time we saw that they aren't, and this choice would essentially force them to be. The second choice is to force monopolies to charge what's called a fair return price. Let's look at these two choices in turn. Okay, so choice number one, allocative efficiency. Remember that allocative efficiency means producing the right things in the right amounts from the point of view of society. Or in other words, producing the societally optimal quantity of whatever good or service we're talking about. Now graphically, that meant and always means producing the quantity that corresponds to the intersection of price, which represents what we're willing to pay for something and therefore what something's worth to us, and graphically, that's shown by the demand curve. So the intersection of the demand curve, price, and marginal cost, what it costs to produce that thing. Or, in shorthand, going to the place in the graph where price, the demand curve, is intersecting or equal to marginal cost. Now, when governments do this, it's sometimes called marginal cost pricing. Sometimes it's called forcing them to charge the societally optimal price. And sometimes this is called the allocatively efficient price. And unfortunately, you might see any one of these three terms on the AP exam. They all mean the same thing, this choice number one option for governments. Alright, so going back to a typical monopolist, if it was unregulated, what the monopolist would do is go to where MR is equal to MC, right? Here's MR, and there's MC in this graph. There's the intersection. That's how it would choose its quantity. I'll call that QUR for unregulated. It goes up to the demand curve, and that's how it chooses its price. I'll call that PUR for the price for an unregulated monopolist, a normal monopolist. Now, if the government forces them to charge the societally optimal price, or the marginal cost pricing, it would force them to go where the demand curve, right here, intersects the marginal cost curve, right here. So there's the intersection. That would be the quantity under the marginal cost pricing, and that would be the price under marginal cost pricing. And you can see why consumers would like this. Compared to the unregulated price, we see that price would go way down. And compared to the unregulated quantity, you can see that the quantity would go way up. So consumers should like that, right? We're getting more stuff and we're paying less for it. So again, we get a lower price and we get a higher and in fact an allocatively efficient quantity. Now there's actually a problem with this kind of pricing, and I'm wondering whether you can see it. Take a look at the graph for a second and maybe even pause and stare long enough until you see what the problem is. Pause, unpause. There's the problem. Under marginal cost pricing, it's possible for the monopolist to actually make a loss. Notice that at this quantity, the price that it's charging right here is less than the average total cost at that quantity. So it would be making a unit loss of this much, and if we turn this into a rectangle, we can figure out its total loss. Well, the monopolist isn't going to be too happy about that. So what that means is that if the government wants the monopolist to do this, it's going to have to provide them a subsidy. It's going to have to give them some amount of money, at least equal to the amount of their loss. Otherwise, the monopolist isn't going to stick around. And that's politically unfeasible, or unfeasible? It's politically not cool. Because if you think about it, what we'd have to say to taxpayers is, pay us some taxes and we'll take part of that and hand it over to these large, relatively wealthy monopolists in order so that we could be allocatively efficient. The electorate would have to know quite a bit about economics in order to understand why that was even possibly a good idea. So there's a problem with marginal cost pricing, and the problem is that you might actually have to subsidize the monopolists, which isn't very politically popular. So that brings us to choice number 2, which is called the fair return price. We've seen that allocative efficiency would be nice, but that it might require a subsidy. So instead, the government might require the monopoly to charge what's called a fair return price. Sometimes this is called average total cost pricing. Graphically, it means producing the quantity that corresponds to the intersection of the demand curve and the average total cost curve. Or in shorthand, going in the graph where these two curves meet, demand and average total cost. So again, here's what an unregulated monopolist would do. Fair return pricing would force them right there, to where the demand curve crosses the average total cost curve, which is happening right there. That would determine the price. I'll call that P sub F for fair return price. And that would determine the quantity. I'll call that Q sub F for the fair return quantity. Now notice that at that price, it's exactly equal to average total cost. In fact, that's the whole idea behind fair return pricing. And what that means is that the monopolist is going to make an economic profit of 0, which is nice. What it means is that we're not going to have to subsidize the monopolist. Remember what it means to make an economic profit of 0. It means that you're doing as well as anything else in the world you could possibly be doing. So the monopolist won't be as happy with that as when it was making positive economic profits. But an economic profit of 0 also means that the monopolist isn't going to leave, right? It's doing as well as anything else it could be doing. So normal profits only. Here we've disgorged some of those profits, nice word there. We've gotten the price down compared to an unregulated monopolist, and we've gotten the quantity up, and we've done it without a subsidy. We're still not allocatively efficient, right? We're still not up here where demand crosses marginal cost. We're still underneath that quantity a bit, but at least we don't have to subsidize the monopolist. So if you want to compare all 3 options, PUR and QUR represent price and quantity if it's unregulated. Here's the fair return price and the fair return quantity. Here's the marginal cost pricing price and the marginal cost pricing quantity. Now that would be ideal from the point of view of society, but again, that requires a subsidy. So the choice between these options is sometimes called the quote-unquote dilemma of regulation, meaning that there's no one really perfect kind of regulation that's going to achieve all the goals that we want for society. If we leave the monopolist alone, we get all the negative effects we saw in the last screencast. If we push them to allocative efficiency, we might have to do so at the expense of giving them a subsidy. We can go the fair return route and therefore not have to subsidize them, but going that route doesn't bring us to that level of allocative efficiency that we'd like to see in markets and that we saw in perfect competition all on its own. All right, that wraps up this one. Only one more to go, and I'll see you then.
My daughter is really something else, man. She runs the house. She runs the whole house. She decides everything. Like we were playing hide and seek the other day. We play hide and seek, and we play by her rules that she invented. And do you know why? Because she sucks at hide and seek. When it's my turn to hide, she tells me where to hide. She tells me where. And then when she hides, this is her hiding. She goes over to a wall and does this. She goes, That's it. There's nothing here.